Flew back up to Auckland, and the pains kept continuing. At this point, we're sort of into the 4th day of these pains, and I hadn't eaten at this point. Another important thing is I hadn't gone and passed a bowel motion for 5 days. I know you didn't need to know that, but medically it's important. On the Tuesday night, I remember I woke up at about 1 in the morning, started vomiting, and at this point, certain alarm bells started going off in my head. So we thought we'd better go to the hospital. So we went to the hospital to experience it on the other side of the reality that I had previously been involved in. Went to the hospital, and we sat in the emergency department for 6 hours before we finally got seen. Long story short, is what they found is that I had a bowel obstruction. They didn't know what it was caused by, but they had to take me into the operating room. They thought that maybe it was a really unusual sort of appendicitis. So they took me into the operating room on a Friday night at this point. Now, this is a week after my symptoms started. Going in, thinking it's probably going to have my appendix out. Normal surgery to have your appendix out is about, I don't know, between 40 minutes and an hour, depending on how complicated it is. My surgery went for 3.5 hours. I remember waking up in the haze after the anesthetic, and my wife was there, and I said, "Hannah, was it my appendix?" And she said, "No, it wasn't your appendix." And I don't know why I said this, but the next thing that I asked was it a tumor? And her reply was, "I don't want to tell you. I'm going to let the doctors tell you." And I said, "No, I want you to tell me." And she said, "Yes, they found a tumor in part of your bowel." 6 days later, the testing came back on the tumor while I was in hospital. And it came back as a bowel cancer, an adenocarcinoma of the bowel. It had spread to some of my lymph nodes, and it spread to another place in my body called the mesentery. I asked the surgeon, I said, what does this mean? And he goes, "Well, you're going to have to go on chemotherapy." I said, "Okay." And I said, "Well, what does that mean for survival?" And he says, "Well, the chances that you'll be alive in 5 years' time is about 40%. I was 27 years old when that happened to me. No family history, nothing, bolt out of the blue. So that year, I took the year off med school. It was my final year, it was supposed to be. And I had chemotherapy for the first 6 months of 2009. In the second half of that year, my wife and I, we went traveling for a couple of months, and we came back, and we had a CT scan as a follow-up to see how everything was going, because they thought they'd cut it all out. Unfortunately, the CT scan showed pretty much the worst thing a CT scan could show for me. The cancer had come back. It come back in lymph nodes right at the back of my abdomen. It wasn't operable, and it had come back really fast, quite aggressive. I said to the doctor, "Well, what does this mean for my 5-year survival?" And he goes, "Well, we don't talk about 5-year survivals anymore. We talk about 2-year survivals." 18 months ago, I got told that in patients like me, we only talk about what your chances of being alive are in 2 years' time. I had to restart chemotherapy in December of 2009. And one of the things I decided was that God had really given me a strong calling into medicine. And I wasn't going to let cancer stop me from doing what God has called me to do. I went back into med school at the beginning of last year. And I have chemotherapy every 2 weeks, once a fortnight. And I was able to finish med school at the end of last year. I qualified as a doctor in November, and I've been working at Auckland City Hospital for the last 6 months. I just completed round 29 of chemotherapy last weekend. Round 30 is this week. The latest update as it stands, I had a CT scan 10 days ago. My tumor has been pretty stable because of chemotherapy. It's kept it stable. The goal of chemotherapy is not to cure me. The goal is to hold the cancer at bay for as long as possible. And for the last 18 months, it has done exactly that. Except for the fact that the scan that I had 10 days ago has shown for the first time 18 months it's starting to grow again. I don't know what that means. I think what it means is that this is the beginning of the end. This cancer is going to kill me unless God miraculously intervenes, there is a very real possibility that this time next year I will not be here. A lot of you will have seen friends and family go through cancer and what it can do. And cancer is not a pretty death. It's agonizing. It's often slow. It's cruel. What do we do when we're confronted with situations like this? I had an identity, who I thought I was. And now I've got a whole new identity, and it isn't who I want to be, or who I thought I wanted to be. John chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. It's the story of a blind man. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Teacher, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it the result of his sins or those of his parents? Jesus replied, it was not because of his sins or his parents' sins. He was born blind so that the power of God could be seen in him. All of us must quickly carry out the tasks assigned to us by the one who sent me, because there is little time left before the night falls and all work comes to an end. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. He spat in the ground, he made mud with his saliva. He smoothed the mud over the blind man's eyes, and he told them, go wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went, he washed, and he came back seeing. Now, this is a passage a lot of us will be familiar with. And there are 3 points that I want us to take away from this passage. The first point is a point I think we already all knew, and that is, there is suffering in this world. We know it because of what we see on TV. We know it because of what we have to go through in our own lives. We know that there is crap going on in this world, and it doesn't make sense. See, one of the things that we seem to have built into us is the sense of fairness. And unfortunately, when we get to experience the world, we realize that the world isn't fair. It should be. Perhaps that's the way God meant it to be. But the world is not fair. When we were in Asia 18 months ago, we went to Cambodia, and there's a place called the Killing Fields where Pol Pot, a dictator in the 1970s, killed 2 million of his citizens just because he had some misplaced ideal about what his country should look like. And you go to these fields and you're walking along and there are bones coming up through the ground because you're essentially walking over the grave of about 100,000 people. And you walk along and there's a thigh bone, and there's a bit of a skull. It's kind of creepy. There's some clothes kind of coming up through the ground, and you realize these were actually living, breathing people who died only because some stink dictator got into power. The world's not fair. Perhaps a little closer to home is something I've heard just in the last 2 days, and I know this is going to be raw for a group of us here tonight. But there was a 19-year-old girl who comes from Tauranga who got recently diagnosed with a brain tumor. She was fit and well. She started vomiting on day 1, and by day 10, she had passed away. I know some people went to see to the funeral today to mourn and celebrate her life. Now, how is that fair? How does that add up? How does the God we know work that out in our lives? The second point I want us to take away from this passage is that Jesus heals. Jesus is a healing God. I'm not going to dispute that, but I'm also not going to explore that any further right now. The third point, and this is possibly the most important point of this passage. God uses us despite the struggles, despite the brokenness, despite the parts of us that aren't working in our lives, regardless. You see, this blind man who was healed, what we read later on in the passage is that he went on and he started teaching the Pharisees who he was. He started teaching the Pharisees about Jesus. The religious authorities of the day were being taught by this beggar who had been a beggar his whole life and blind, and he was being used through this guy's disability to build God's kingdom.